47 seconds. That was all she would need to change everything. But none of them knew that yet. The Mojave Desert stretched endlessly in every direction, a landscape of burnt ochre and hostile silence. July 1992. The thermometer had already crept past 108 degrees, and it wasn't even noon. Heat waves shimmered off the asphalt like spirits rising from the dead. Kerrigan Shaw stood at the edge of the training facility at Marine Corps Air Ground Combat Center 29 Palms, watching the assembled men through polarized sunglasses. She was 27 years old, 5'6", and weighed 132 pounds. Her dark hair was pulled back in a regulation bun, so tight it seemed to stretch her features into something severe and unforgiving. In her duffel bag, wrapped in an old t-shirt that still smelled faintly of gun oil and memories, was her father's M1911 pistol, the same weapon Major Daniel Shaw had carried into Grenada 9 years ago, the same weapon they'd returned to her mother in a flag-draped box, along with a folded letter and a silver star. She'd been 9 years old when two Marines in dress blues knocked on their door in Camp Lejeune. She remembered her mother's scream, a sound that seemed to come from somewhere deeper than the throat, somewhere primal and broken. She remembered the way the afternoon light had suddenly seemed too bright, too ordinary for the end of the world. What she remembered most was the silence that followed, the terrible, suffocating silence that had filled their house for months afterward, broken only by her mother's muffled sobs at 3 in the morning when she thought Kerrigan was asleep. She never was. For 3 years after that knock on the door, Kerrigan had experienced panic attacks so severe that twice she'd been hospitalized. Once during a history class when the teacher mentioned Grenada. Once at her high school graduation, when the crowd's applause had suddenly transformed in her mind into the sound of gunfire, and her mother had to carry her out of the auditorium while everyone watched. It had taken therapy. It had taken time. It had taken learning that what she was experiencing wasn't weakness. It was her mind trying to process something it wasn't designed to handle at 9 years old. Now, 18 years of training later, Kerrigan had become the youngest close-quarters combat instructor in Marine Corps history. She'd earned her position through broken bones, torn ligaments, and a determination that bordered on obsession. Every technique she mastered, every record she broke, every obstacle she overcame was a conversation with a ghost. "Look at me, Dad. Watch what I've become." The 40 Marines gathered before her were fresh from Operation Desert Storm. They'd spent the past year pushing Saddam Hussein's Republican Guard back into Baghdad. They'd seen combat, they'd taken lives, they'd lost friends, and now they'd been ordered to spend 3 weeks learning hand-to-hand combat from someone they'd never heard of. The resentment was palpable, thick as the desert heat. Staff Sergeant Maddox Corvin stood at the front of the formation, arms crossed over a chest that could have been carved from granite. He was 34 years old, 6'3", 220 pounds of combat-hardened muscle and simmering contempt. His service record read like a highlight reel of controlled violence. Confirmed kills in Kuwait, a Bronze Star for valor, the unwavering respect of every man in his unit. He'd heard the rumors about their new instructor. Some woman from Quantico, some paper pusher who'd never seen real combat, coming to teach them how to fight. The thought made him want to spit. Master Gunnery Sergeant Harlan Boschert stepped onto the platform at the front of the assembly area. He was 58 years old, with a face like weathered leather and eyes that had seen 3 wars. His voice, when he spoke, carried the weight of decades of command. "Gentlemen, you've been selected for the Corps' new Close Quarters Combat Enhancement Program. For the next 3 weeks, you will train under the supervision of our lead instructor." He paused, and something flickered across his face. Pride, perhaps, or anticipation. Instructor Shaw, front and center. Kerrigan walked forward. The reaction was immediate and predictable. A ripple of surprise, followed by barely suppressed laughter. Whispered comments passed through the ranks like wildfire. "You've got to be kidding me. This is the instructor? She looks like she weighs a $120 soaking wet. 3 weeks of this? I'd rather be back in Kuwait dodging scuds." Maddox Corvin didn't laugh. He simply stared, his expression cycling through disbelief, confusion, and finally settling on something cold and dismissive. "Permission to speak freely, Master Guns?" His voice cut through the murmuring like a blade. Boschert's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. Granted, Staff Sergeant, we just spent a year killing Republican Guard. Real combat, real enemies who shot back. Maddox took a step forward, his presence dominating the space. With respect, what exactly is she going to teach us that we don't already know? The question hung in the air like a thrown gauntlet. Kerrigan removed her sunglasses. Her eyes, the color of storm clouds over the Atlantic, met Maddox's gaze without flinching. When she spoke, her voice was calm, almost conversational. You learned how to kill from a distance, Staff Sergeant. Rifles, artillery, air support. What happens when the distance disappears? When your rifle jams, your sidearms empty, and the enemy is close enough for you to smell what he had for breakfast? Maddox's eyes narrowed. Then we improvise. Improvise? Kerrigan let the word hang for a moment, tasting its inadequacy. In close quarters combat, improvisation gets you killed. Proper training is the difference between going home in a seat and going home in a box. A low rumble of discontent passed through the formation. Someone in the back muttered something about little girls playing soldier. Kerrigan heard it. She was meant to hear it. I understand your skepticism, she continued, her voice never rising above conversational. You've been to war. You've proven yourselves in ways that most people can never imagine. That experience is valuable. It's also incomplete. She began to walk slowly in front of the formation, her boots crunching on the gravel with each measured step. In Desert Storm, coalition forces engaged the enemy at an average distance of 300 meters. Air superiority meant you rarely face close-quarters scenarios. But the next war won't be fought in open desert. It'll be fought in cities, in buildings, in rooms where your rifle becomes a liability instead of an asset. She stopped directly in front of Maddox Corvin. The question isn't what I can teach you, Staff Sergeant. The question is whether you're smart enough to learn. The silence that followed was absolute. Even the desert wind seemed to hold its breath. Maddox's face darkened like a storm rolling in from the Pacific. With all due respect, ma'am, I've seen combat. Real combat. Not training exercises and qualification courses. You want to talk about close quarters? I've been close enough to see the light leave a man's eyes while my hands were around his throat. So have I. Something in her tone made him pause, a hardness beneath the calm surface like bedrock beneath sand. You want to know what I can do? Kerrigan took a step back, creating space. Pick 4 of your best. Have them attack me, all at once, Maddox blinked. Excuse me? 5 total, including yourself. Any technique, any approach. Only rule is no weapons. She checked her watch, a battered Casio that had belonged to her father. You have 60 seconds to put me on the ground, starting when you're ready. For a moment, nobody moved. The audacity of the challenge seemed to have frozen everyone in place. Then Maddox Corvin smiled. It wasn't a pleasant expression. It was the smile of a predator who'd just been handed permission to hunt. You heard the lady. He gestured to 4 Marines in the front row. Corporal Brennan, 6'1", former collegiate wrestler. Lance Corporal Tate, compact and fast, with a reputation for dirty fighting. Sergeant Hollis, the unit's combatives champion. Private First Class Decker, young but aggressive, with something to prove. All of them combat veterans. All of them looking at Kerrigan like wolves sizing up a lamb that had wandered too far from the flock. They spread out, forming a loose semicircle around her, professional, coordinated. They'd done this before, in training and in combat. Maddox positioned himself directly in front of her, rolling his shoulders. Last chance to back out, ma'am. No shame in admitting you bit off more than you can chew. Kerrigan's response was to shift her weight slightly, settling into a stance that looked almost casual. Relaxed, as if she were waiting for a bus instead of preparing to fight 5 combat-hardened Marines. Clock's ticking, Staff Sergeant. Corporal Brennan moved first, lunging from her left with a haymaker designed to end the fight in one blow. His fist cut through empty air as Kerrigan pivoted, using his momentum against him. Her palm struck his elbow at the precise angle needed to hyperextend the joint. Not enough to cause permanent damage, but enough to make the arm useless. He went down with a grunt of surprise and pain. 2.3 seconds. Lance Corporal Tate came next, reaching for a chokehold from behind. Kerrigan dropped her center of gravity, slipped beneath his grasp like water through fingers, and drove her elbow into his solar plexus with surgical precision. As he doubled over, gasping, she swept his legs and guided his fall with a control that was almost gentle. 4.7 seconds. Sergeant Hollis and PFC Decker attacked together, trying to overwhelm her with coordinated aggression. She moved between them like water flowing around stones, using Hollis's body as a shield against Decker's strikes. A knee to the inside of Hollis's thigh deadened his leg. She'd struck the femoral nerve with millimeter accuracy. A palm strike to Decker's chest sent him stumbling backward, gasping for breath as his diaphragm spasmed. 12.2 seconds. That left Maddox Corvin. He hadn't moved during the exchange, watching with growing disbelief as four of his best men were dismantled with surgical precision. Now he faced her alone, his confidence replaced by something more cautious, more calculating. He was a skilled fighter. Years of Marine Corps martial arts program training, supplemented by boxing and Brazilian jiu-jitsu. He'd used those skills to survive situations that would have killed lesser men. But as he engaged Kerrigan Shaw, he realized within seconds that he was completely outclassed. She didn't fight like anyone he'd ever faced. Her style was fluid, adaptive, constantly shifting between techniques he recognized and movements that seemed to come from nowhere. Every attack he launched was redirected. Every defense he mounted was circumvented. She was reading him like a book, anticipating his moves before he made them, exploiting openings he didn't know he was leaving. When she finally took him down, it was with a joint lock so precise that he couldn't move without risking permanent damage to his shoulder. Her forearm pressed against his throat, not hard enough to choke, but hard enough to make the point absolutely clear. 47 seconds total. 5 Marines on the ground, 1 woman standing. The assembled formation stood in stunned silence. Some of them had their mouths literally hanging open. Kerrigan released Maddox and stepped back, offering him a hand up. He stared at it for a long moment, pride warring with pragmatism, before accepting. That, she said, addressing the entire formation, her breathing barely elevated despite the exertion, is what proper close-quarters combat training looks like. Those 47 seconds represent 47 chances for you to die if this had been real. Your combat experience is valuable, but it has blind spots. I'm here to eliminate them. She walked back to the front of the platform, her posture unchanged, her voice steady. For the next 3 weeks, I will teach you techniques drawn from Krav Maga, the line combat system, and methods I've developed through years of research and practice. You will learn to fight when fighting is your only option. You will learn to serve when survival seems impossible. Her eyes swept across the formation, meeting each gaze in turn. More importantly, you will learn that combat is not just about destroying the enemy. It's about protecting the Marine beside you. My father used to say that the mission means nothing if you lose the people you're fighting with. He died living those words. I intend to make sure you understand them. In the formation, Maddox Corvin stood with his rescued arm hanging slightly numb at his side. His shoulder would ache for days. His pride would ache longer, but somewhere beneath the humiliation, beneath the instinctive resentment at being bested by someone half his size, something else stirred. A memory he'd spent 9 years trying to bury. Major Daniel Shaw, Grenada, October 1983. Maddox had been a young private then, barely 25, on his first real deployment. The invasion of the small Caribbean island was supposed to be a quick operation. In and out, textbook stuff. Nothing about combat is textbook. His unit had walked into an ambush near Point Salines. Cuban military advisors, better trained and better positioned than intelligence had suggested. In the chaos that followed, Maddox took a round to his leg and went down hard. He remembered lying in that drainage ditch, watching his blood soak into foreign soil, certain he was going to die thousands of miles from home. The pain had been secondary to the fear, the absolute, overwhelming certainty that he would never see his family again. Then Major Shaw appeared. The officer had no business being there. His unit was supposed to be providing support fire from a ridge 200 meters away. But Shaw had seen Maddox fall, had seen the Cubans closing in, and had made a choice. Shaw had carried Maddox to cover under withering fire, taking a round to his side in the process. He'd held off the advancing enemy long enough for extraction to arrive. his rifle speaking in controlled bursts while blood soaked through his uniform. When the helicopter came, Shaw had ordered Maddox aboard first. "Get him out. I'll cover." Those were the last words Maddox ever heard from Major Daniel Shaw. Minutes later, the position was overrun. Shaw's body was recovered the following day. He'd taken out at least a dozen enemy combatants before the end. For 9 years, Maddox had carried that debt. For 9 years, he'd told himself that Shaw died because Maddox was too weak, too inexperienced, too slow to save himself. That a good man had paid with his life for Maddox's failure. And now Shaw's daughter stood before him, having just put him on his back in front of 40 witnesses, proving that the man who'd saved his life had passed down something extraordinary, a legacy of skill and determination that Maddox could barely comprehend. The universe, Maddox thought bitterly, had a vicious sense of humor. Brigadier General Thaddeus Drummond arrived at 29 Palms 3 days into the training program. He was 60 years old, with silver hair cropped close to his skull, and a reputation for making careers or breaking them with equal efficiency. His uniform bore decorations from 3 decades of service, and his eyes held the calculating intelligence of a man who'd navigated military politics longer than some of his subordinates had been alive. He found Kerrigan in her temporary office, reviewing training reports by the light of a single desk lamp. The desert night had dropped the temperature to something almost bearable, but the tension in the room suggested otherwise. "General," Kerrigan rose to attention. "At ease, instructor." Drummond settled into the chair across from her desk without waiting for an invitation. "I wanted to see how things were progressing." "We're on schedule, sir. The initial resistance is—" "I know about the initial resistance." Drummond's voice was flat. "I also know about the demonstration you gave on day 1. 5 Marines in 47 seconds. Word travels fast in this corps." Kerrigan said nothing. She'd learned long ago that generals rarely ask questions when they had something to say. "This program is controversial, Instructor Shaw. There are people in Washington who believe close-quarters combat training is obsolete in the age of precision munitions. There are people who believe that a female instructor cannot effectively train male combat veterans. There are people who want this program to fail. I'm aware of the skepticism, sir. Are you aware that you have exactly 3 weeks to prove them wrong?" Drummond leaned forward, his eyes boring into hers. "If this program doesn't produce measurable results, it won't just be shut down. It will be buried so deep that no one will try anything like it for a generation. Every woman who dreams of standing where you're standing will have that door slammed in her face." The weight of those words settled over Kerrigan like a physical force. "I understand the stakes, General." "Do you?" Drummond studied her with eyes that had seen decades of military politics and personal ambition. "Your father was a good man, a good Marine. His sacrifice at Point Salines meant something." "I know what my father's sacrifice meant, sir." "Then prove it." Drummond rose, straightening his uniform. 3 weeks, Instructor Shaw. Make them count." After he left, Kerrigan sat alone in the darkness for a long time, her father's pistol heavy in her hands. The metal was cool against her palms, worn smooth by years of use. The stakes weren't just about her career. They weren't just about the program. They were about every woman who would come after her, every door that would open or close based on what happened in the next 18 days. And somewhere in the back of her mind, a quieter thought emerged. 40 Marines, 3 weeks, 1 chance. Among them, the man her father had died saving. Fate, it seemed, had a way of closing circles, whether you wanted it to or not. Day 5. The training intensified with each passing hour. Kerrigan drove her students through combat scenarios that pushed them to their physical and mental limits. Hand-to-hand engagements, knife defense, weapon retention, close-quarters room clearing. The Marines learned quickly that their new instructor demanded perfection not through shouting, but through relentless repetition and unflinching critique. She noticed everything: a foot position 2 inches off optimal, a grip that would fail under pressure, a hesitation measured in fractions of a second. Again. That single word became the soundtrack of their existence. Again, again, again. The desert sun beat down without mercy, pushing temperatures past 110 degrees. Men who'd survived the burning oil fields of Kuwait found themselves pushed to new limits by a woman who seemed immune to the heat, the exhaustion, and the resentment that still simmered beneath the surface. Corporal Sloan Merritt was struggling. She was 24 years old, the only female Marine in the training group, and she'd been fighting invisible battles long before Kerrigan Shaw arrived. Small incidents at first, comments that could be dismissed as jokes, touches that could be explained as accidents in tight spaces. Then Sergeant Dietrich had cornered her in the equipment storage room 3 months ago. He'd made his intentions perfectly clear, his hands rough and demanding in the darkness. Only the unexpected arrival of another Marine had prevented something terrible from happening. Sloan had reported nothing. In the Marine Corps of 1992, such reports had a way of destroying the careers of the women who made them, not the men they accused. She'd seen it happen to others, transfers to dead-end postings, whispered accusations of attention-seeking, careers quietly suffocated while the perpetrators continued to advance. So she'd stayed silent. She'd watched Dietrich smile at her during formations, that knowing smile that said, "I can do whatever I want." She'd felt his eyes on her during training, tracking her movements with predatory patience. She'd developed a constant low-grade nausea that never quite went away. Kerrigan noticed. She noticed the way Sloan flinched when certain Marines came too close. She noticed the way the young corporal's technique deteriorated whenever Dietrich was in her vicinity. She noticed the haunted look in Sloan's eyes that had nothing to do with combat stress, a look Kerrigan recognized from her own mirror years ago. On the sixth night, Kerrigan found Sloan alone in the training facility, practicing strikes on a heavy bag with a desperation that bordered on violence. Each impact echoed through the empty space like a gunshot. Sweat soaked through her T-shirt, and her knuckles were raw and bleeding. "Your form is off." Sloan spun, hands coming up in automatic defense. When she saw who it was, she relaxed marginally, but her eyes remained wary. "Ma'am, I was just getting in some extra practice." "I can see that." Kerrigan stepped onto the mat, her movements unhurried. "You're telegraphing your strikes. Your weight distribution is wrong. And you're fighting angry." "I'm fine, ma'am." "No, you're not." The words hung between them, heavy with unspoken understanding. Kerrigan began to circle the heavy bag, her movements unhurried, her voice conversational. "When I was 19, I was attacked during a training exercise at Quantico. A fellow Marine who decided that a dark storage room and an isolated female recruit presented an opportunity." Sloan's breath caught. "He outweighed me by 80 pounds. He was faster than he looked, and he was very confident that no one would believe me if I reported him." Kerrigan's voice remained steady, almost clinical. "He was wrong about several things that night. The most important was underestimating what proper training can accomplish." She stopped circling and faced Sloan directly. "I put him in the hospital for 6 weeks. Broken jaw, dislocated shoulder, and 3 cracked ribs. The investigation that followed ended his career and led to 3 other women coming forward with similar stories. He's currently serving his 8th year in Leavenworth." Sloan's eyes had widened. "Ma'am, you don't have to tell me anything, Corporal. You don't have to report anything. But you need to understand something." Kerrigan stepped closer, her voice dropping. "What happened to you is not your fault. What happens next is your choice. I can teach you to never feel helpless again, but only if you trust me." For a long moment, Sloan Merritt stood frozen, 9 months of suppressed fear and shame warring with something new, something that felt dangerously like hope. Then she nodded, a single tear cutting a clean track through the dust on her cheek. "Teach me." For the next 2 hours in that empty training facility, Kerrigan Shaw taught Sloan Merritt things that weren't in any official manual. Techniques designed specifically for smaller defenders against larger attackers. Methods that turned an assailant's size and strength into vulnerabilities. Ways to inflict maximum damage with minimum effort. When they finished, Sloan's hands had stopped shaking. "Remember," Kerrigan said as they prepared to leave, "the goal isn't to win a fair fight. There's no such thing as a fair fight when someone attacks you. The goal is to survive and make them regret ever thinking you were weak." "Yes, ma'am." "And Corporal, when you're ready to file that report, and only when you're ready, I'll stand beside you." Lance Corporal Rowan Kessner was falling apart. He hit it well. 26 years old, solidly built, with a face that defaulted to stoic competence. His service record was exemplary. His performance in training was adequate. But Kerrigan saw the signs. The micro flinches when loud noises erupted unexpectedly. The thousand-yard stare that crept into his eyes during certain exercises. The way he sometimes froze for a fraction of a second too long, as if seeing something that wasn't there. On day 8, during a high-stress combat simulation, Rowan Kestner shattered. One moment he was engaging a training dummy in a mock room-clearing exercise. The next, he was on the ground, hyperventilating, his body locked in a fetal position, while his mind was somewhere else entirely. Kuwait, February 1991. The Highway of Death. His best friend, Corporal Marcus Webb, burning alive in a destroyed vehicle while Rowan watched helplessly from 20 feet away. The screams that had lasted for what felt like hours. The smell of burning flesh that had seared itself into his memory, surfacing without warning at random moments. In showers, in mess halls, in dreams that left him afraid to close his eyes. The other Marines stood in uncomfortable silence, unsure how to respond. Mental health issues were not discussed in the Corps of 1992. Men were supposed to be strong. Men were supposed to push through. Men were supposed to drive their demons so deep that no one would ever know they existed. Maddox Corvin stepped forward. Someone get him to medical. He's done. No! Kerrigan's voice cut through the chaos. She knelt beside Rowan, not touching him, simply making her presence known. Kestner, can you hear me? His breathing was ragged, desperate, sweat soaked through his uniform. His eyes were open, but seeing something 18 months and 7,000 miles away. Kestner, you're at 29 Palms. You're in California. It's August 1992. The war is over. You're safe. Slowly, agonizingly, Rowan's breathing began to stabilize. His eyes focused, finding Kerrigan's face like a drowning man finding shore. There you are. Her voice was calm, steady, an anchor in the storm. Take your time. We're not going anywhere. It took 15 minutes for Rowan to fully return to the present. When he did, the shame in his eyes was almost worse than the panic had been. Ma'am, I'm sorry. I don't know what happened. It won't happen again. I swear, Training is secured for the day. Kerrigan rose and addressed the group. Everyone hit the showers. Kestner, you're with me. The other Marines filed out in uncertain silence. Maddox lingered at the door, his expression unreadable, before finally departing. In the empty training facility, Kerrigan sat down on the mat across from Rowan, maintaining a respectful distance. Tell me about Kuwait. It wasn't an order, it was an invitation. Rowan's hands trembled. Ma'am, with respect, I'd rather not. I'm not asking as your instructor. I'm asking as someone who understands. Something in her voice made him look up. What he saw in her eyes wasn't pity. It wasn't clinical detachment. It was recognition. After my father died, Kerrigan said quietly, I had panic attacks for 3 years. Sometimes in the middle of the night, sometimes in the middle of class. Once during my high school graduation ceremony, my mother had to carry me out of the auditorium while everyone watched. Rowan stared at her. This woman who had dismantled 5 Marines in less than a minute, this instructor who seemed to be made of steel and certainty. She was admitting to weakness, to vulnerability. It took therapy. It took time. It took learning that what I was experiencing wasn't weakness. It was my mind trying to process something it wasn't designed to handle. She paused. What you're going through has a name, Kestner, and it's not cowardice. For the next 2 hours in that empty training facility, Rowan Kestner told his story. The convoy, the ambush, the explosion that turned their vehicle into a furnace. Marcus Webb's screams as the flames consumed him. Screams that had only stopped when there was nothing left to scream. The smell of burning flesh that still haunted Rowan's dreams 18 months later. Kerrigan listened. She didn't offer false comfort. She didn't minimize his pain. She simply listened, bearing witness to a burden he'd been carrying alone. When he finally finished, exhausted and raw, she made him a promise. You're not done, Kestner. Not by a long shot. We're going to get through this training, and then we're going to find you someone who specializes in what you're dealing with. There are people who can help. But first, I need you to trust me. I trust you, ma'am. Then trust this. Whatever happened in Kuwait, it doesn't define you. What defines you is what you do next. Day 12. The tension between Kerrigan and Maddox had evolved into something complex and unspoken. He no longer openly challenged her authority. His compliance with training protocols had become meticulous, almost exaggerated. But beneath the surface, something festered. The scheduled combat simulation was designed to test command decision-making under pressure. A mock hostage rescue scenario, 3 rooms, multiple threats, one high-value target to extract safely. Kerrigan had designated Maddox as team leader, responsible for coordinating the assault. The objective was straightforward. The execution should have been textbook. Maddox deliberately ignored Kerrigan's tactical recommendations. When she instructed him to breach from the east entrance, which offered better cover and cleaner sightlines, he chose the west. When she advised a staggered approach to minimize exposure, he ordered a simultaneous assault. When she warned about the simulated threat in the second room, he dismissed her assessment entirely. The result was catastrophic. 3 hostages killed in the crossfire simulation, 2 assault team members wounded with paint rounds. A scenario that should have been a controlled success became a chaotic failure. In the debrief, Maddox stood at attention, his face a mask of professional neutrality. The scenario presented unexpected variables, ma'am. We adapted as best we could. You didn't adapt, Staff Sergeant. You deliberately contradicted every tactical recommendation I provided. Kerrigan's voice was ice. Wishy-ah, the question hung in the air. Maddox's jaw tightened. Permission to speak freely, ma'am? Granted. With respect, ma'am, your tactical recommendations are based on training exercises and theoretical knowledge. My decisions were based on combat experience. Real-world variables don't always align with classroom theories. Your combat experience got 3 hostages killed today. Simulated hostages in a training exercise. And if those had been real civilians, real Marines depending on your judgment? Kerrigan stepped closer, her eyes never leaving his. Your combat experience is valuable, Staff Sergeant, and I've never disputed that. But your pride is going to get people killed. Something flickered in Maddox's expression, something dark and painful. My pride has already gotten people killed, ma'am. The words seemed to surprise him as much as they surprised her. For a moment, the mask slipped, revealing something raw beneath. 9 years of guilt compressed into a single crack in his armor. Then it was gone, replaced by the stone-faced compliance of a career Marine. Request permission to be dismissed, ma'am. Kerrigan studied him for a long moment. Dismissed, Staff Sergeant. After he left, she remained in the empty briefing room, replaying his words. My pride has already gotten people killed. The pieces were starting to connect. The resentment, the defiance, the way Maddox sometimes looked at her with an expression that seemed equal parts hostility and grief. She needed to understand, and she knew exactly who to ask. Master Gunnery Sergeant Harlan Boschert had served with Daniel Shaw for 12 years before Grenada. They'd been more than colleagues. They'd been brothers in all but blood, the kind of bond that forms between men who've saved each other's lives more times than either could count. When Kerrigan found him that evening, he was sitting on the hood of a Humvee, watching the sun bleed red across the desert horizon. The sky looked like it was on fire, bands of crimson and gold painting the clouds. Beautiful, isn't it? He said without turning. The desert at sunset. Your father loved it. Said it reminded him that even the harshest places had their moments of grace. Kerrigan leaned against the vehicle beside him. Tell me about Maddox Corvin. Boschert was quiet for a long moment. The setting sun painted his weathered face in shades of amber and shadow, deepening the lines around his eyes. I wondered when you'd ask. He reached into his pocket and produced a worn photograph, its edges soft from years of handling. Grenada, October 25th, 1983. That's your father on the left, Corvin on the right. In the image, 2 men stood against a backdrop of tropical vegetation. Daniel Shaw, young and vital, his arm around the shoulders of a barely adult Maddox Corvin. Both were smiling, unaware that death was less than 48 hours away. Corvin was just a kid then, private first class, first deployment, scared out of his mind and trying not to show it. Your father took him under his wing, taught him, protected him, said the kid reminded him of himself at that age. And at Point Salines? Boschart's expression darkened. Your father shouldn't have been there. His unit was supposed to provide covering fire from the ridge. That was the plan. But when Corbin went down, Shaw made a choice. He went after him, sprinted 200 meters across open ground, under fire from at least a dozen Cuban positions. Boschart turned to face her directly. He carried Corbin half a mile to the extraction point, took a round doing it, and still held off the enemy long enough for the helicopter to land. When the bird touched down, Shaw made them take Corbin first, said he'd cover the withdrawal. And by the time they could come back, the position was overrun. We found him the next day. Boschart's voice cracked slightly. He'd taken out at least a dozen of them before the end. Went down fighting. Kerrigan absorbed this, feeling the weight of new understanding settle over her. Maddox thinks it's his fault. Maddox has spent 9 years believing that your father died because he was too weak to save himself. That's a hell of a burden to carry, especially for a man like him. Boschart met her eyes. Now you show up, Shaw's daughter, and you're stronger than him, better than him. You just proved that in front of everyone. And that threatens him? No, that confuses him. Boschart shook his head slowly. If your father was as good as you are, then Shaw didn't die because Corbin failed. He died because he chose to, and that's almost harder to accept. Why? Because it means your father's death wasn't a punishment for Corbin's weakness. It was a gift, and gifts like that create obligations that can never be repaid. Kerrigan looked out at the desert, where the last light was fading into purple darkness. Stars were beginning to appear, faint pinpricks in the vast canvas of the sky. How do I reach him, Harlan? Boschart smiled sadly. The same way your father would have. You show him that strength isn't about never needing help. It's about knowing when to ask for it and when to give it. It's about understanding that we fight for each other, not just alongside each other. Day 15. The 48-hour field exercise began at 0400, while the desert was still wrapped in pre-dawn darkness. The Mojave spread before them in all its hostile magnificence, a landscape designed to break the unprepared. During the day, temperatures would exceed 110 degrees. At night, they would plummet toward freezing. The terrain was a maze of rocky outcrops, dry washes, and vegetation that seemed designed specifically to cause injury. The scenario was straightforward on paper. Kerrigan and Boschart were the targets, high-value personnel who needed to be located and captured. The 40 Marines, divided into 4 10-man teams, had 48 hours to find them. Standard pursuit and evasion, complicated by the unforgiving environment. Maddox Corbin commanded the primary pursuit team. For the first 24 hours, everything proceeded according to plan. The teams spread out in coordinated search patterns. They maintained communication protocols. They systematically covered ground while conserving water and energy. Kerrigan and Boschart stayed ahead of them, leaving just enough trace to keep the pursuit engaged while never allowing themselves to be cornered. It was a dance they'd performed dozens of times in training exercises around the world. Then everything changed. It happened in a rocky canyon 12 miles from the base camp. Rowan Kestner's team was traversing a narrow ledge when the ancient stone gave way beneath his feet. The fall was only about 15 feet, enough to break bones, not enough to kill. Rowan landed in a heap at the bottom of the ravine, his left leg twisted at an angle that made several Marines turn away. Compound fracture, femur. The bone was visible through the torn fabric of his trousers, stark white against the dark blood. The scream that echoed through the canyon was followed by a silence, somehow worse. Maddox arrived at the scene within minutes, having heard the commotion over the radio. He took one look at Rowan's leg and knew they were facing a critical decision. Medevac is 45 minutes out. Corporal Sloan Merritt had already made the call, her voice steady despite the blood draining from her face. They're dispatching from the main base. That's too long. Maddox knelt beside Rowan, whose face had gone gray with shock. We need to stabilize him and get him to the extraction point ourselves. The extraction point is 4 miles east. Another Marine checked the map, his finger tracing the terrain. There's no way we can carry him that far in this terrain, not without making the injury worse. Then we find a way. Staff Sergeant, what about the mission? It was Sergeant Dietrich, his voice carefully neutral. We're close to locating the targets. If we divert resources to carry Kestner, we lose any chance of completing the exercise. Maddox looked at Dietrich for a long moment. Something shifted in his expression, a hardness replacing the uncertainty. Screw the mission. Staff Sergeant, I said, screw the mission. Maddox's voice was quiet, but it carried the force of absolute conviction. We don't leave Marines behind. Not for any objective. Not for any exercise, not ever. He looked around at the assembled faces, seeing uncertainty in some, agreement in others. Those of you who want to continue the pursuit, go. I won't stop you, but I'm carrying Kestner to that extraction point if I have to do it alone. For a long moment, no one moved. Then Sloan Merritt stepped forward. I'm with you, Staff Sergeant. Another Marine moved, then another. Within 30 seconds, the entire team had committed to the evacuation. Only Dietrich remained hesitant, his expression calculating. But even he eventually fell in line, recognizing that standing alone against the consensus would be noted and remembered. They built a makeshift stretcher from ponchos and branches. They took turns carrying their wounded comrade, 2 Marines at a time, while the others secured the path ahead. 4 miles through hostile terrain, 4 hours of exhausting, back-breaking labor, 4 hours during which not a single man suggested they abandon their mission or their brother. Rowan drifted in and out of consciousness, the pain overwhelming despite the morphine from the medical kit. In his lucid moments, he tried to apologize. Should have watched my footing, shouldn't have. Shut up, Kestner. Maddox's voice was gruff but not unkind. Save your strength. The mission can go to hell. You're more important than any objective. From a ridge overlooking the route, Kerrigan Shaw watched through binoculars. Beside her, Boschert observed with the quiet satisfaction of a man seeing a theory proven correct. He gets it now, Boschert said softly. Yes. Kerrigan lowered the binoculars. He finally does. The helicopter lifted off with Rowan Kestner aboard, its rotors beating the air into submission as it raced toward the base hospital. The medical team had already radioed ahead. Orthopedic surgeons were preparing for surgery. The prognosis was good. Clean break despite its severity, no nerve damage, full recovery expected within 6 months. Maddox stood at the edge of the extraction zone, watching the aircraft disappear into the pre-dawn darkness. His muscles screamed from the exertion of the past 4 hours. His shoulders bore bruises from the stretcher poles. His throat was raw from the dust he'd swallowed. He'd never felt more alive. Something had shifted during that 4-mile carry. Some weight he'd been dragging behind him for 9 years had finally, mercifully, begun to lift. Get him out. I'll cover. Major Shaw's last words. The words Maddox had interpreted as accusation for so long. You were too weak to save yourself, so I had to die for you. But maybe that wasn't what Shaw meant at all. Maybe those words were simply what they appeared to be. An order, a choice, a father and a Marine doing what fathers and Marines do, protecting those in their care, regardless of the cost. Not because the person being saved was too weak, but because the person doing the saving was strong enough to make that choice. Kerrigan Shaw appeared out of the darkness like a ghost. Her face was smeared with camouflage paint, her uniform dusty from 2 days in the desert. But her eyes were clear, and for the first time since Maddox had met her, warm. The exercise is over, she said. You failed to capture your targets. I know. General Drummond will want a full debrief. He's already heard about what happened with Kestner. I know that too. They stood in silence for a moment, 2 people who had been circling each other for weeks, finally standing still. Staff Sergeant Corvin, Kerrigan's voice had lost its instructor's edge. Maddox, my father didn't die because you were weak. He died because he chose to save you. That's not a burden for you to carry. That's a gift for you to honor. Something broke loose in Maddox's chest, something he'd been holding so tightly for so long that he'd forgotten he was holding it. I've hated myself for 9 years. His voice was barely a whisper. I've told myself that if I'd been stronger, faster, better, then my father would have made the same choice anyway, because that's who he was. Kerrigan stepped closer. The best way to honor his sacrifice isn't to torture yourself. It's to be the kind of Marine who would make the same choice if you had to. She gestured toward the horizon where the first light of dawn was starting to paint the sky in shades of rose and gold. Tonight, you made that choice. You put a wounded Marine ahead of the mission. You carried him 4 miles through hostile terrain. You showed everyone in your unit what leadership actually looks like. Maddox met her eyes. I think I finally understand what he was trying to teach me. I think you do too. The debrief took place in the main conference room at 29 Palms, with General Drummond presiding. The 40 Marines sat in formation, exhausted but attentive. Kerrigan stood at the front, her posture ramrod straight despite 2 days without sleep. The exercise, Drummond began, his voice betraying nothing, was a failure. The targets were not captured. The primary objective was not achieved. Kerrigan said nothing. The Marines said nothing. The weight of those words pressed down on all of them. However, Drummond's tone shifted almost imperceptibly. I have received a different assessment from my observers in the field, an assessment that suggests this exercise demonstrated something more valuable than tactical success. He turned to Kerrigan. Instructor Shaw, your evaluation. Kerrigan stepped forward, addressing the room. The primary objective of this exercise was never to capture targets. It was to determine whether close-quarters combat training could produce Marines who understood that victory means nothing if you sacrifice your principles to achieve it. She began to walk slowly along the front of the formation. When Lance Corporal Kestner fell, you faced a choice: complete the mission or save your brother. You chose correctly. Not because the mission didn't matter, but because you understood that protecting your brother matters more than completing any objective. She stopped in front of Maddox Corvin. Staff Sergeant Corvin made that call. He put Kestner's life above his own ambition, his own pride, his own desire to prove himself. In doing so, he demonstrated exactly the kind of leadership this Corps needs. Maddox stood at attention, his jaw tight with emotion. That's the lesson, gentlemen. Fighting is easy. Any fool can throw a punch. Knowing when not to fight, knowing when to carry instead of combat, that's what separates Marines from mere soldiers. General Drummond stood. In light of this assessment, I am declaring the exercise a success. Furthermore, I am recommending that this training program be expanded and implemented across all Marine combat units. A ripple of surprise passed through the formation. Instructor Shaw, you have exceeded expectations. The Corps is fortunate to have officers of your caliber. Thank you, sir. Drummond's expression remained stern, but something in his eyes suggested approval. The formal ceremony will take place tomorrow. Dismissed. As the Marines filed out, Sloan Merritt approached Kerrigan. Ma'am, I wanted to thank you. Her voice was steadier than it had been 2 weeks ago, stronger. Not just for the training, but for everything else. What are you thanking me for, Corporal? You did the work. You showed me I could. Sloan hesitated, then straightened her spine. And I filed the report about Sergeant Dietrich, about what happened before. Kerrigan felt something tighten in her chest. That took courage. It took you showing me that staying silent wasn't strength. It was just fear wearing a different mask. Sloan met her eyes directly. I'm not afraid anymore. After she left, Kerrigan found herself alone in the conference room. The weight of the past weeks pressed down on her. The challenges, the confrontations, the small victories and near defeats. Then Harlan Boschert appeared in the doorway, holding something in his weathered hands. I've been carrying these for 9 years, he said, walking toward her. Your father asked me to give them to you when you were ready, when you'd earned them. He opened his palm. Dog tags, dented, scratched, stained with something that might have been rust, but probably wasn't. Daniel Shaw, Major, USMC, the numbers and codes that reduced a man's life to bureaucratic shorthand. He was proud of you, Kerrigan. Even then, when you were just a kid playing soldier in the backyard with a stick for a rifle. He told me once that you were going to be better than him, stronger than him. He said it like it was the most obvious thing in the world. Kerrigan took the tags. They were surprisingly warm, as if they retained some echo of the man who'd worn them. I spent so long trying to prove myself to him, she said quietly, to make him proud. He was already proud. Everything after was just you becoming who you always were. For the first time in a very long time, Kerrigan Shaw allowed herself to cry. Not the tears of grief she'd shed as a child. These were different. These were release. The formal ceremony the following morning was brief but significant. General Drummond announced that the program would continue, with Kerrigan as its permanent director. The 40 Marines who had completed the training were recognized for their accomplishment. But the moment that mattered most happened afterward, away from the cameras and dignitaries. Maddox Corvin found Kerrigan standing at the edge of the parade ground, looking out at the desert that had tested them all. "Ma'am." He came to attention and rendered a salute more precise than any he had given in years. "I owe your father my life. I spent 9 years thinking that debt could never be repaid." Kerrigan returned the salute. "At ease, Staff Sergeant." "I was wrong." Maddox's voice cracked slightly. The debt wasn't to be repaid. It was to be honored. By being the kind of Marine he would have been proud to serve with. By understanding what he was trying to show me with his last act. He paused, gathering himself. By recognizing that the woman standing in front of me carries his legacy better than I ever could. "What my father did for you wasn't a transaction, Maddox. It was a gift. The only repayment required is to pass it on." Maddox nodded slowly. "Then that's what I'll do, for as long as I wear this uniform." They shook hands, not as instructor and student, not as the daughter of a dead hero and the man he'd saved, as equals, as Marines. The story didn't end at 29 Palms. Stories like this never really end. They ripple outward, touching lives in ways their originators never anticipate. 18 months later, Staff Sergeant Maddox Corvin was deployed to Mogadishu, Somalia, as part of Operation Continue Hope. The humanitarian mission had deteriorated into urban warfare, and American forces found themselves fighting block by block through a city that had become a maze of ambushes and hostile fire. On December 5, 1993, Maddox's patrol was caught in a coordinated attack in the Bakara Market District. Enemy fire came from 3 directions: rooftops, alleyways, windows. Within seconds, his rifle was empty, his sidearm jammed, and 9 of his Marines were pinned down with no clear path to extraction. In the chaos that followed, Maddox Corvin remembered a training facility in the Mojave Desert. He remembered 47 seconds. He remembered carrying a wounded Marine 4 miles through hostile terrain. Most importantly, he remembered that leadership isn't about completing objectives. It's about bringing your people home. Moving through the kill zone like a man possessed, Maddox engaged the enemy with hand-to-hand combat techniques he'd learned from Kerrigan Shaw. Krav Maga strikes that disabled opponents before they could react. Line combat system takedowns that turned their own weapons against them. Methods that made his body a weapon when all other weapons had failed. He neutralized 7 combatants in close quarters fighting, creating a gap in the enemy lines that allowed his Marines to withdraw to defensible cover. All 9 survived. Maddox earned his 2nd Bronze Star that day. When asked about his actions by the citation board, he said simply, "I had a good teacher. She taught me that the mission is never more important than the Marines you're fighting alongside." Corporal Sloan Merritt completed her service and applied to the Marine Reconnaissance Training Program in 1994. She was told she would fail. Women didn't belong in reconnaissance units. Women couldn't handle the physical demands. Women would be a distraction to the male operators. She graduated 3rd in her class. The techniques Kerrigan Shaw had taught her, the ones designed for smaller defenders against larger attackers, proved invaluable during the grueling selection process. When larger candidates tried to overpower her in combatives training, she turned their strength against them. By 1997, she had established herself as one of the most effective reconnaissance Marines in her battalion. Her field reports were cited as models of clarity and tactical insight. Her leadership under fire earned the respect of soldiers who had initially questioned her presence. When asked about her success, she spoke of a night in a training facility when an instructor had taught her that strength isn't about size or gender. It's about refusing to be a victim. It's about taking control of your own survival. Sergeant Dietrich was court-martialed in 1993 following Sloan's report and testimony from 3 other women who found the courage to come forward. He received a dishonorable discharge and 2 years of confinement. The case contributed to policy changes that would, over time, make it easier for victims to report harassment and assault within the military. The fear he'd relied on, the certainty that his victims would stay silent, had been his undoing. Lance Corporal Rowan Kestner's leg healed completely, as the surgeons had predicted. The physical therapy was grueling, But he attacked it with the same determination that had gotten him through boot camp. The deeper wounds took longer. With Kerrigan's support, Rowan connected with a Veterans Affairs counselor who specialized in post-traumatic stress. The process was slow. There were setbacks. There were nights when the flames of Kuwait seemed close enough to touch, when Marcus Webb's screams echoed through his dreams. But gradually the weight began to lift. He learned that his mind wasn't broken. It was trying to protect him from memories too painful to process all at once. He learned techniques for managing the flashbacks, for grounding himself in the present when the past threatened to overwhelm him. By 1997, Rowan had completed his service and enrolled in a graduate program in clinical psychology. His focus was treating combat-related trauma in veterans. His thesis explored the relationship between unit cohesion and post-combat mental health outcomes, arguing that the bonds formed in combat could be either a source of healing or a trigger for continued suffering, depending on how they were processed. In 2002, he opened a clinic in San Diego dedicated to helping returning service members process their experiences. The waiting list was always long. The success rate was remarkably high. On the wall of his office hung a framed photograph of his graduating class from 29 Palms, 1992. Beneath it, a small plaque read, "You're not done, not by a long shot." The program Kerrigan Shaw created evolved over the decades that followed. It was refined through thousands of training iterations, expanded to include new techniques developed in response to changing combat environments, and eventually integrated into standard Marine Corps training protocols under the name Shaw Protocol. The name was Kerrigan's choice, not for herself, but for her father. By 2024, more than 18,000 Marines had completed the program. The techniques Kerrigan developed became part of the foundation for modern military close-quarters combat training. Her emphasis on decision-making under pressure, on protecting comrades while engaging enemies, on understanding that victory means nothing if you lose your humanity in the process. These concepts shaped a generation of warriors. Kerrigan herself continued to serve until 2015, when she retired at the rank of colonel. Her career included combat deployments to Afghanistan and Iraq, where she applied the principles she'd spent decades teaching. She was wounded twice, decorated 4 times, and never lost a single Marine under her direct command. At her retirement ceremony, attended by hundreds of current and former students, she delivered a brief speech that would be quoted in leadership courses for years to come. The measure of a warrior is not in the enemies they defeat, but in the comrades they protect. Fighting is the easy part. Any fool can throw a punch or pull a trigger. The hard part is knowing when violence serves a purpose and when it doesn't. The hard part is being strong enough to carry someone instead of walking away. She paused, her hand touching the dog tag she still wore around her neck. My father taught me that we fight for each other, not just alongside each other. He died living that truth. I've spent my life trying to make sure others understand what it means. Because in the end, missions are just objectives on a briefing slide. People are what make those objectives worth pursuing. At the Marine Corps Close Quarters Combat Training Center in 29 Palms, California, there is a bronze plaque mounted near the main entrance. It was installed in 2010, on the 18th anniversary of the program's founding. The plaque shows 2 figures, a woman in combat stance and a man being helped to his feet. Beneath the image, an inscription reads, 47 seconds to prove what you can do, a lifetime to prove who you are. Colonel Kerrigan Shaw, USM's below that in smaller letters, dedicated to Major Daniel Shaw, 1949 to 1983, who taught us that people matter more than missions. Every Marine who passes through those doors learns the story. The daughter who carried her father's legacy. The man who finally understood what that legacy meant. The 40 warriors who learned that strength isn't just about fighting. It's about knowing what's worth fighting for. The program continues to this day. The lessons continue to save lives. The ripples continue to spread. Kerrigan Shaw is 59 years old now. She lives in a modest house outside Quantico, Virginia, not far from where she spent her earliest years. The walls are decorated with photographs spanning 4 decades of service. Formal portraits, candid shots from training exercises, images of Marines she trained who went on to serve with distinction. Her father's M1911 sits in a glass case in her study, cleaned and maintained but never fired since 1983. His dog tags hang beside it on a simple hook, catching the light from the window. Some mornings when the light is right and the house is quiet, she sits in that study and remembers 29 Palms in the summer of 1992. 40 Marines who thought they had nothing left to learn. A man named Maddox Corvin who carried more guilt than any person should bear. She remembers Sloan Merritt's face when she finally understood that she was allowed to fight back. She remembers Rowan Kestner's voice breaking as he described the flames of Kuwait. She remembers Harlan Boschert pressing her father's dog tags into her palm. Most of all, she remembers the moment when everything changed. When 40 hostile strangers became 40 committed students. When resistance transformed into respect. When a man who had spent 9 years hating himself finally learned to forgive. The real work had never been about fighting. It was never about the techniques, the takedowns, the demonstrations of physical superiority. It was about showing them that strength isn't measured in the damage you can inflict. It's measured in the people you can protect, the burdens you can carry, the choices you make when no one is watching. Teaching them wasn't about combat, it was about connection. It was about showing them that the greatest battles aren't won with fists and firearms. They're won with choices. The choice to protect instead of abandon. The choice to carry instead of walk away. The choice to see the humanity in your comrades and defend it, even when defending it costs you everything. Her father had lived that truth. He had died for it. Now, decades later, thousands of Marines carried that truth inside them, passed down like an inheritance more valuable than any material legacy. That was Daniel Shaw's true gift to his daughter. Not the pistol, not the dog tags, not even the genes that made her faster and stronger than most men twice her size. His gift was a principle, a belief, a way of being in the world that placed human connection above military objectives, compassion above conquest, love above glory. Kerrigan Shaw spent her life honoring that gift, and in doing so she created something that would outlast her own mortality. A legacy measured not in kills, but in saves. Not in victories, but in values. Not in the enemies she defeated, but in the brothers and sisters she helped become the best versions of themselves. There's a story they tell at 29 Palms now, passed down from instructor to instructor, class to class. They say that once, a woman walked into a room full of combat veterans who thought they had nothing left to learn. They laughed at her. They dismissed her. They were certain she had nothing to offer them. 47 seconds later, 5 of them were on the ground, and everything they thought they knew had been shattered. But that's not the lesson. The lesson is what happened next, how she rebuilt them, how she showed them that true strength isn't about domination, it's about protection. How she took 40 broken, arrogant, wounded men and women and forged them into something better. The lesson is that she didn't just teach them to fight, she taught them to care, and that made all the difference.